You know, I don't remember thinking much about what I was going to be doing other than farming. I knew I was going to Mississippi State. I knew that for several years in high school. I was dating a couple different girls and really enjoying high school. Really, I just made average grades and all that.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
When Pearl Harbor came along, it really didn't change what I was thinking, other than I knew I was going into the service when I got old enough, because I wasn't old enough at the time. So my parents had moved out into the country about 15 or 20 miles from Drew. So I moved in the Drew Hotel, which was right across the street from where I lived at that time. And one of my friends lived there, so I moved in just right after Pearl Harbor and finished out my high school senior year from Drew High School. When I finished school, I immediately went to Mississippi State and entered school as a freshman in the summer of 1942. The war had started, and I didn't know much about what was going on in Europe or the Pacific or anywhere. But I thought I would get as much college as I could get before I went into the service. They weren't going to draft me because I was only 17 years old. So I went on through summer school and then went back to Mississippi State in the fall. I remember I pledged Sig Ep in the summer and went to school through Christmas, January and February, and on into May of 1943. I was drafted in May of 1943 and was delayed by my draft because I was in college at the time, and they let me finish out the year. I went to Camp Shelby and was drafted in Camp Shelby. After I got to Mississippi State and I had been taking some ROTC, and he did recommend that I transfer to a tank unit, and he was located somewhere in Texas, I don't know where, but he was a friend of the colonel who was in charge of the ROTC there at Mississippi State. But I didn't get it. They had put me in the Air Corps, and when they did, I went through basic training in the Air Corps at Gulfport, Mississippi. And when I got through with my basic training, they sent me to aircraft mechanic school in Wichita Falls, Texas. Twin engine aircraft mechanic school. B-25 and B-26s is what I went to. We studied one day at a time, and we took up certain things. Well, we went from one end of a B-25 and a B-26. A day was assigned to us learning certain parts. We studied engines, we studied the radios and the guns and stuff like that. I didn't know anything much about PBYs, B-17s, B-24s at that time because I had no experience with them at all. In fact, I didn't have any experience with any planes at all. And I didn't even think about going into the Air Force until I got in there, and I wanted to go to tank destroyer, and so I wasn't even thinking about a plane then. I was thinking about tank destroyer, but they wouldn't put me in there, so they put me in the Air Corps, and then is when I became interested in twin-engine bombers, because that's what I was studying in the aircraft mechanic school. When I finished aircraft mechanic school in Wichita Falls, they sent me then to Pensacola, to the Navy base there, where they had PBYs. And I was assigned to a pilot. The pilot that I was assigned to was Lieutenant Guess, and he and I went through that school in Pensacola, trained together, talked to each other. I was in my position and with engine controls and engine temperatures and all that. We made several flights, landed in the water around Pensacola, and we were in PBYs that had wheels. And most of the planes there didn't have wheels. And they called it a semi-parasol wing because it was up above the fuselage. It was a big wing, 104 feet, which was the same as a B-24, I think. And it was just a little bit longer than a B-17. B-17 was something slightly less than that, I think. It had a little wheel in the front for the tricycle, and then the things folded up into the sidewall of the plane. It worked pretty smoothly, really. When we let the gear down, it slowed the plane down a little bit, because of the drag. Yeah, we were real slow. The only way we could get up speed was to go into a dive. If we headed down from 10,000 feet, we could get to moving pretty fast. The wings were 104 feet, and these floats would open up and drop down, and then when we were flying, we'd raise them, and that would speed the plane up a little bit. We had one name for the plane, low and slow. If we were going to the flight line, we were going to the low and slow, And we would get in from the left side in a blister. We had a pilot and a co-pilot in the front of the plane. We had a navigator that sat behind the pilot and the co-pilot in the next compartment. In addition to the navigator, we had a radio man who sat over on the right-hand side. Ours was named McCoy. We were one of the few planes then flying that had a medic in it. Because when we'd pick up some people, some of them would be hurt, you know, and that kind of thing. Picture of our crew taken at Biloxi, Mississippi. And this is the pilot, Brian Guess, and the co-pilot, Cowboy Wall. Cowboy was from North Carolina, and Brian was from Florida. And this is me, and this is the medic, and this is the radar man. And this is Arnold McCoy, who is our radio man. We were then sent to Atlanta, Georgia, where we picked up a new PBY. We started flying to San Francisco. It took us about a week maybe to fly over there because we weren't flying very fast. When we got to San Francisco, we were briefed on flying from there to Honolulu. It was going to take about 20 hours to fly over there. I remember when we got out over the Golden Gate Bridge, and we flew right over it going out of San Francisco. We were maybe a short distance out from the shore, but here this P-61 fighter that was patrolling the West Coast, he sneaked right up under our wing, and I could see the guy's face. And he followed us for 30 minutes or so, I guess, and then he peeled off. And we kept on going, and it did take about 20 hours. I forgot exactly what that flight was. And then we spent the night there, or maybe 2 nights, and we came south from Honolulu, and then we went over to Midway. And eventually we got up to Moratai, which was an island in the Halmahera group. It was on the equator, and so it was hot. And it was hot day and night and the whole time. It wasn't any problem for me. It was just like I was camping out in Boy Scouts before. We never did get cold. Even in December or January, you know, we didn't get cold. We stayed in tents there. We didn't have barracks. We had a wooden floor that they'd put up, and then some tents, and we slept in those. We had a tent for our mess hall. We had outdoor latrines, had some walls around them so you couldn't see inside them, and that kind of thing. We had church on Sunday, and those who went to church, went to church. Then we went to mess hall after church and that kind of thing. Officers' quarters, and they lived in tents too. We had a dispensary. We had a hospital of a sort. We had a movie thing set up, We'd have a movie out there at night. They gave us 1 ounce of 100 proof liquor when we got back in from a mission. So every day after we completed a mission, late afternoon, we'd go over to the medical dispensary and get our we'd take a bottle with us, and they'd pour it in that bottle, and we'd build us up a thing of 100 proof. Now we could buy beer though. They'd bring back beer from Australia, but we used to go from Moratai down to Australia. They'd buy groceries, and we'd have fresh potatoes and fresh eggs, just every now and then. We had all the tools, and that. We had to find out what was wrong with it if we didn't know, but we could pretty well tell what was wrong with the engine. Golf tees, we all kept a bunch of golf tees to plug into the rivet holes down below, and it stopped the leaks. Every time we land in water, it would start coming in. And it wasn't that many, but it was some, and but those things worked real good. The PBY had a position with engine instruments, and it was right up there in front of the engineer, and he was sitting in that little bitty thing right between the two engines. We would set the fuel mixtures and things like that. We had some engine instruments that we were responsible for handling. After the war, I think they finally fixed them so that the pilot could do that, but the thing had a runway or that you could walk from the nose all the way to the back tunnel, which was back behind the blisters. I had a ladder that I would climb up right under that thing down to the runway that we'd walk on all the way through. The only thing that you could see of me in the plane were my feet. I was watching engine instruments, and the ones that I had control of, if it was running hot or cold or whatever needed to be done to the engines, I synchronized the engines. My position was right between those engines. I looked out the window just at eyesight, and there was one engine on the left and one engine on the right. I was closer than anyone else to the engines themselves. I pretty well sat in my position and watched the performance of the engines. I was the crew chief. I was in charge of the enlisted people on the ship. I was responsible for directing them in whatever they were doing. I didn't know anything about the radios, but I was responsible for directing them. I didn't know anything about the medics, but I was, again, responsible for directing them in the rescue. When we were making a rescue, we approached the people that we were rescuing very carefully. We were in the plane all the time. We didn't get out of the plane, but the engines were still running even though they were idling more or less on the water, unless the pilot was going somewhere or making a turn or something like that in the water. But other than that, I pointed out to the crewmen what to do to get those people into the plane, into one of the blisters. And it was new to them The people that we rescued, and I think it was 30 some odd people that we rescued, the PBY was all new to them. They may have come out of a B-24 or 25 or whatever, but the PBY was something brand new. And it was a plane that was 10 years old at the time of the war starting, you know. Those first ones didn't have wheels and all that. Our flights were pretty long flights, and we were flying pretty often. We'd fly one day, and then we wouldn't fly the next day. I don't think we ever did fly 2 days in a row. They'd give us 1 day's rest. We flew over mostly to Balikpapan, which was on the east coast of Borneo. B-25s, B-26s mostly made bombing raids on Balikpapan. And we would circle right off the shore and watch these bomb squadrons go over Balikpapan and drop their loads. When they dropped their loads, they would call us and tell us whether they had been hit by anti-aircraft. They had a lot of anti-aircraft there. I remember that when we were flying back home, our pilot, and we called him Pop Guess, Pop would drop down and land in some little bay off an island or some kind, and then we'd all go swimming or something like that. Swim maybe for an hour and then take back off. In addition to the bombing done by the Air Force, we had several destroyers and light cruisers, and they were just laying off the base shelling. They were shelling the hole all the time. And when we came into land, after they had ditched, we were nearly wrecked by the big guns on those cruisers and destroyers, because that's all they were doing. They were just sitting out there shelling Balikpapan. But we had to call them and tell them to hold off the shooting until we got on the ground, which, of course, we very quickly did as soon as we could, and started taxiing toward them. The plane didn't go down. One part of it or something like that went underwater and didn't go very far because we were in shallow water. So we taxied up. They were in a lifeboat. The crew all landed, ditched together, got out on the wing, and then got into a life raft and shoved off. If they ever got their feet wet, I don't even know that they did. And we picked them up, pulled them in, and took off as quick as we could. We had to call the cruisers again, tell them to stop while we took off, and we did, and we got out of there as quickly as we could, and made our first rescue, really. But then, as we put in missions, we would be briefed every day before our mission and told to come back by Uni. Uni was between Balikpapan and Borneo. If not on a straight line, it was not too far off line. But they told us to do that, and we would. And then we got kind of bold and maybe pretty sassy. We would shoot up the island. We could see these Japanese just running all on the ground, trying to run away from those bullets, and some of them did and some of them didn't, you know. But we came in one day on the way back to Moratai, and they had set up a anti-aircraft gun out on a little tip kind of island. It was right where we flew, just exactly right where we flew. And they must have studied every day where we would fly, and each plane would fly in a little bit different place. So they had it down pat. So we flew right over that anti-aircraft gun, and all they had to do was pull the string, and we wasn't over 20 feet from them. You know, I mean, we were just right down on the island with them. But it blew out one engine, so we went over, and we kept going down because we only had one engine and was pulling away from the island. That island, we were told, was a headquarters type island, and they had a lot of little boats around there that they'd go different islands and that kind of thing. But when we got back, our officers reported it and told what all had happened and all that kind of stuff. Well, the colonel got pretty upset about it, so he called 13th Air Force and told them to send him a fighter down there. And they told him that they didn't have a fighter that they could send him or whatever, but the colonel had been down in the South Pacific before the war. So he knew that whole country down there. He flew all these different places and everything, but he knew it. So he told him, he said, well, if I come up there, will you give me one? And so they told him that they would. So he went up and got a P-38. And he came back and he made a number of missions over there over the next 2 or 3 days. And he just blew that place to pieces with that P-38, with machine gun and some 20 millimeters, I think. But he just tore that thing up. The Aussies from that island had gone down the west coast of Borneo. They'd take several Australian soldiers with them and let them out on the shore, maybe 50 miles south of where we were, or 75 or something. And they'd fan out and just kill any Japs that they could find. If they could pick them up, they'd pick them up and bring them back. They captured several, not very many, really, not a big lot, but they captured several Japanese soldiers when they'd go down there. And this was away from us. This wasn't on Moratai. This was on Borneo. And they called us and wanted us to go back and pick up the wounded natives that had been shot. The Aussies sent a PBY in, and it crashed. And then they called us, and we went in. So we were pretty careful about landing on that lake, making sure that we didn't run into some stumps and things like that. We taxied over toward this village. All these natives started coming out, and they were bringing the ones We had a flight surgeon with us on that trip because we were going in there to get some people who were wounded. All of these natives were in little boats, and helping get the people on the plane and all that kind of stuff. And this little girl was sitting in one boat, and I don't know why, but I thought she was the prettiest little old girl I had ever seen. She was just a beautiful, beautiful girl. She was small, but she was just a beautiful, beautiful girl. I never could get over the fact that she was so pretty. And then, of course, when we got them all picked up, we lined up with the lake that we were on and took off, and the surgeon and a medic that we had, beside the one that we had in our crew, they were working on those people, just dressing wounds and things like that, I think. Some things they didn't do until we got back to camp and had better facilities. The Australian chief of staff called us and asked if he could borrow a PBY to ferry him over to Borneo. It was right after the Australians had invaded Borneo. In fact, they had invaded Balikpapan. They lost some people there, but they didn't lose that many because they'd been shelling it, and bombing it and all that kind of stuff. We picked him up, the general, and he had a colonel who was his aide. He went everywhere the general went, and so he went with us. And we went on the island of Brunei on the west coast of Borneo. They had just invaded it, the Aussies had. So when we got there, we landed, and in the water, there wasn't any place other than that to land. We could land in the water, and then we taxied up on the ground. Yeah, we had some headhunters on Borneo. And they stayed to themselves mostly, and they would kill the soldiers. I think they thought if they would kill someone who wasn't a headhunter, they would go to their heaven. The Australian soldiers, they'd have Thompson submachine guns pointing right at them all the time they were anywhere around, because they were scared that they would kill them too. They would pay them to kill and bring back heads of Japanese soldiers. I think it was 6th Combat Camera Unit, and this guy had cameras and all that. We made a mission to Balikpapan and covered a strike of bombers. When the strike was all over, we headed home, and we had the cameraman with us. Then we got a call from his B-24 that had been shot down, and we knew where they had gone down. So we headed to that spot. Another PBY headed to the same place, and they beat us there. They beat us there by probably 30 minutes or so. We got there, and they were on the water already and picking up. the crew. The crew had lost 2 or 3 people, I think, in the ditching. They picked them all up and then started taxiing to get in position to take off in a certain direction and heading home. We then got in position to be flying alongside them, not real close, but we were pretty close too. We had good pictures when they got in position to start their takeoff run. We were right in position taking the pictures. As they started their takeoff, we flew as slow as we could right alongside them and was taking that picture. And then at the last, we saw a big wave on the end of their takeoff run that hit the back end of the plane. And when it did, it tipped them over and they went right straight down. So they crashed on takeoff. And this combat cameraman, he got all of the pictures of it. He got good pictures of it. After we went down there and picked up the remaining people, some of those people had just been in a ditching of a B-24 and then the crashing of that PBY. And so they were pretty well shaken up. And they did not want to take off. They absolutely did not want to take off. But our pilot said that he was going to take off, and we got those people all down and secure. Then we took off on our takeoff. I remember the first bounce on the takeoff. We bounced up and eased right on back down and hit the water again. And kept on going, was gaining a little speed all the time. We maybe bounced another time. Then we finally bounced up and started back down, but we didn't hit the water. And we kept picking up speed enough to hold us up and got off. And man, we were all happy to get off the water. Mm-hmm. A PBY made open sea landings. You can land on a lake or on smooth water or something like that and take off and all that, and it's pretty easy. But in situations like this water was, it had already crashed one man, one PBY. So when we got it off the water, it was happy. It is as happy as it was sad before. The PBY on open sea landings and takeoffs. The open sea is just, it's a world big, and water is moving in kind of massive amounts. The pilot and the co-pilot really have a job. There's a yoke that comes from this side of the pilot up and turns, got a wheel here, goes over and goes back down on the other side, and they got a wheel over on this side. The co-pilot's job is to wrap his arm around that yoke and brace himself so that when the pilot starts rocking that boat, he can help the pilot rock. And because it is hard and it takes a lot of strength to rock that thing in some tough water. It'll get up on a step and then another step, and it'll finally raise up just a little bit. Now, if it's smooth, it's no problem, but in an open sea, it is tough. It's bad. It's I guess about as bad as combat is, We were on an island down near the island of Leyte. They dropped the first bomb, and then they dropped the second bomb, and the second bomb, I believe, is when this thing happened. These were American soldiers, too. We were in a tent, and they were in a tent. It was a big tent. When they dropped it bomb, everybody was happy, and we knew that the war was going to be over pretty quick and all that, or figured that it would, you know. These soldiers that was in the tent right over from us, not very far, they had a Thompson submachine gun, and they just cut the top out of our tent, and the tent came down, or started down. It didn't come down all the way, but it started down. We dropped down. We thought the Aussies had come in. The Japs had come in. So that night, we had already had supper, getting ready to go to bed. We heard a commotion over on a small river. It wasn't very deep. Looked over there, and they had this Japanese man, and he was buck naked, standing out there in that water with his hands up, and he didn't have any armament or anything like that. So they took him in. The Aussies took him in and all that. We had several missions. I flew one or two missions, but they weren't combat missions. But we were trying to rescue somebody who had gone down. Clark Field at that time was a huge field, huge. They had flown in, I don't know how many airplanes, and parked them there. They had all this space, and they had them just jammed together. The war was over, and they gave crews that had completed their missions and told them that they could come to Clark Field and they could get them a crew together and pick them out of a plane and fly that plane home. We had a few missions picking up some of those planes. They didn't get very far, most of them didn't. They'd pre-flight them pretty well, but a lot of those planes had some problems, and they didn't know what they were. They were flying somebody else's plane, you know. But then I started working mostly on the line. I know we had one PBY that had a bad engine, and I started tearing the engine apart. I know I had one cylinder off, and when I left over there, and it was still off. So somebody else had to put it back on, you know, which they had other people to do it. So. Wasn't too long after that they shipped me to Manila, and I boarded the plane and headed to San Francisco in this old warship, headed home. Flat-bottom Liberty ship. And I don't think most of the people were flyers. They may have been in the Air Force, but they weren't flyers. But they got sick. I mean, they got real sick. But we sailed out of Manila and headed toward San Francisco.
13th Air Force B-24 lies ditched in enemy waters, 100 feet off the coast of Jap-held Celebes. Forced down after participating in a pre-invasion strike against Balikpapan gun positions, the Liberator's crew await rescue by Catalinas of the Jungle Air Force's 2nd Emergency Rescue Squadron. Survivor pickup is accomplished safely, but as the plane takes off, it crashes, killing 3 men. The crashed plane's companion PBY lands immediately to take aboard surviving crew members. The importance of patrolling long-range bomber routes is indicated by rescue statistics for this single unit. 300 flyers saved during its first 6 months of operations.